Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn,
And I'm Sarah Callan.
and today we are going to be reviewing the film Oppenheimer, and we are joined by a very special guest, Dillon. Dillon is with us today. Dillon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I'm Dillon. I'm a casual movie enjoyer, but a bit of a World War II fan. Fan's maybe not the right word. History. So very excited.
Perfect. Well, we have you on for the right type of movie. All right, so let's start off with our. Oh, actually, no. Let's have Sarah give us a one-sentence summary for Oppenheimer before we do our one-sentence summaries. Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
The story of American scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer and his role in the development of the atomic bomb.
All right, and now we will do our one-sentence summaries. I got excited there for a hot second. Dillon, do you want to kick us off with your one-sentence summary for Oppenheimer?
Sure. No matter how smart you are, the house always wins.
Yep.
Oh, yes, the house. Sarah, what was your one-sentence summary?
Mine is physics is hard, feelings are harder.
Oh, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts about this movie now.
That's great.
My one-sentence summary is odds of this 3-hour behemoth being made without the Nolan name is near zero.
Yep, well played.
Okay, so let's start off with our initial thoughts about Oppenheimer. And in this first section, we will not spoil this movie. It is a recreation of historical events, so perhaps this is a little bit of a moot point, but alas, we will not talk too much about the ending and the way the ending structured of this movie. Okay, so let's start off with our overview of thoughts. Dillon, I am curious to hear your thoughts about Oppenheimer.
I want to start with saying
Okay.
it was too short.
Wow. Okay, tell us more.
Um, so even though it was 3 hours, like it went by so fast, and it moved so quickly. Like just the transitions and uh, the pacing of the action was constant. Like it was exhausting. Like I felt like I was in a race, and yet it still felt like the story wasn't fully rounded out in some areas. But I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I was hooked. Like I love like extended edition Lord of the Rings, like long format movies, but this for its length, I felt like just blew those out of the water. Honestly, like Lord of the Rings is great and all, but they didn't pull off a 3 hour movie as well as Nolan did. Phenomenal visuals, audio, themes. I felt like I got multiple movies all in one. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah.
I really loved it.
All right. And you also got to experience this in the IMAX theater, yes?
Yes, I
I'm curious
did.
to hear, maybe, share a little bit about that experience as well and what it added to your movie going.
Yeah, so I will also say this is my first IMAX movie ever, and
You chose a good one.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Pick
yeah.
one.
It was insane. Obviously, there are big sound moments in the movie, and being able to feel and hear everybody's like sharp inhales as we were all shocked by loud booms and things going on was insane. Like literally feeling all around you the bass um, just in you, and again hearing the people next to me kind of like tense up and react as well as we were shocked by it was so immersive. It was incredible. Probably the best movie going experience I've ever had.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. Oh my goodness. Yeah. 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 Especially the opening of this, I can imagine being just a reverberation into your soul, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Sarah, what were your thoughts about Oppenheimer? Dillon, we'll have to unpack a lot more of what really worked for you later. Sarah, your thoughts about Oppenheimer?
No, I think this movie is, everything that Dylan just said. It is a phenomenal achievement. And I really feel like this film is Christopher Nolan at the peak of his powers. Like everything in this comes together, and you are drawn into Oppenheimer's world, and everything about this kind of makes you like submit to this world, which I think is just fascinating the way that this thing is constructed. And like Dylan said, like it is 3 hours, but it doesn't feel like 3 hours. Because it just moves at such a pace that you are forced to be hooked into it so that you're not left behind. So I think that this is a just wow, like what a movie he has created. I think my feelings about this have been made more complicated since leaving the theater. I watched it like 2 days ago, and so the more like research I've done into what actually happened, and as I've thought about Oppenheimer in the larger context of film and what the stories that we tell say about us, like my feelings about it have grown more complicated, even though technically it is just astounding. So I'm in this really weird place of like I had such a good time watching this, but then in a larger context, I'm not sure that I feel super positively about this story and how it's being framed maybe. So I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of difficult things that I'm grappling with this movie, even though I had such a great time with it and loved it in the theater. So I don't know. I'm a little all over the place. So I think this is going to be a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I was curious to know if you had dove into the research of this because you often love to do that with films that are based on true events. And it sounds like there's some interesting things that you've stumbled upon. So I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on that front. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm going to be the contrarian of this episode. um,
Yes! Oh, I'm
Ask you
so
which
one.
excited.
this is going to be, I feel like there's going to be a lot for us to talk about. I felt like this felt like a 3 hour long movie to me. um, and I think I referenced it in my one sentence summary, but I was just that this movie felt very long to me, and there were some scenes and some like especially exposition, especially in the first section, that felt a little bloated, and I just kept thinking like there is an amount of like freedom and leeway that I think these creators have because of the clout and the reputation that they've built, where they have the ability to create a movie that is really leaning into those heavy bits of dialogue and exposition. And I think that there's definitely a buffet of themes that are so integral to this movie, but I think that I lacked the feeling of pace and forward momentum that I felt in other Nolan films. And I think some of it is just the feeling of time constraint that often creates this feeling of okay, let's like we need to keep going, we need to keep pushing out on these discoveries and these explorations. And there is that feeling of time pressure that I think I was wanting, um, for this to feel like a forward momentum experience. I think like some of his other films like Dunkirk and even Tenet, honestly, as big and bloated as that film is as well, there is a sense of time constraint that creates that forward propulsion. And I really lacked that in this movie. So this felt wandering in a lot of ways to me, like a smattering of people and moments and themes. And I was wanting it to be, I think, a little bit more tightly woven together. The other aspect of this is that I think that there's a lot of interesting character moments that felt like we touched on them, especially with the kind of like moral questions that are at play here, that I think we start to introduce and touch on later into the film. And I would have loved for the film to go a little bit deeper and explore that a little bit more. So I'm someone who tends to love like pretty character driven films. And I think that there was so much happening here and so much packed in that it left me wanting more on that front as well. So we can dive in a little bit more to like continue to tease apart all of these different pieces because I think Dylan, you and I had such a different viewing experience, which is kind of fun to be able to talk
Yeah.
about more too.
Mm. Mm. I can't wait.
Yeah. Okay, this seems like a good time to include a spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen Oppenheimer, we recommend checking it out before continuing to listen. As you've heard from Dylan, this is definitely an experience that rewards the movie going experience. Go and see this at a theater before continuing to listen. All right, we now have full reign. Where shall we begin? There's a lot of
Okay, Dylan,
directions
what
to
did
go
you
in.
love about this?
Yeah.
Just
could,
gush for as long as you want.
could I
Yes.
start with maybe like a couple moments in the movie that were just really good for me?
Yes. Let's go. Let's start there.
The Obviously, my first pick is going to be the Trinity test when they actually detonate the first atomic bomb out in the desert. I obviously didn't pull my phone out or time it, but they say detonation in 90 seconds. And best I could tell, like you actually went through the whole 90 seconds. And as they're panning around the camp and everybody's prepping for it and reacting to it differently and kind of saying their little side pieces, and you can tell people are stressed. And they so well play at that tension at the near zero thing, like they couldn't rule out if they were going to destroy the whole world. And I actually felt I felt like I was there. Like I felt like I sort of understood what those men and women might have been feeling, thinking in that moment that they might be destroying everything just in dropping that. Um, in that slow count as they actually drew out the 90 seconds. Oh, it just worked for me. Like for all the times that they jumped around super quick throughout the film, going through just that minute and a half in all of its glory, and then of course the slow delay on the explosion and the delayed shockwave. Oh, I was mesmerized. I was lost in the movie in that moment. I don't know. Did that land for either of you?
That scene worked for me as well. Yeah. And I think the choice to cut away and have that silence for when that
Mm,
explosion went off also created this moment of like you feeling and having the space also mentally to like feel the weight of what they just done and really consider that. I think that the alternative of like experiencing the sound and the kind of adrenaline rush of the explosion would have given you the sensory experience, but I felt like I had space to really let the weight of what they were doing, like almost space to think, you know what I mean? Like the silence to think in that moment. And then you get kind of the shockwaves like a little bit delayed. So I thought that choice was really wise of them to do as well, to cut away that sound right as the explosion goes off.
yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And when you see it all unfolding, because it's silent, uh, when you see that plume happen, there's this feeling of both awe and horror at the same time as the reality of what was created kind of sinks in to you. And I think the way, like, we've all seen explosions in movies before, but the way that they were able to construct this test, you could feel the weight and the momentum of what they were doing, which made the explosion even more impactful and even more effective.
I don't know how true this is. I don't know if either of you know more details, but I read this morning that there's no CGI in this film.
Hmm.
Either
Correct. That's what I read too.
So they actually just detonated a massive bomb out in the middle of nowhere for this.
Hmm. Yep.
Well, hey, it worked.
That's insane. That's
And I love
insane.
like some of the, I mean, because Christopher Nolan's whole thing is like no CGI stuff. So like leading up to this movie, I saw on social media like, did Christopher Nolan actually detonate an atomic bomb? Which I just thought was really funny and like also a really effective way of building up, press and excitement and curiosity slash horror for this movie. But yeah, no, they made that with practical effects, which is bonkers.
Insane. Another moment for me that and I've got some critiques that kind of go alongside of it, but just as a moment, was his I forget her name, but the first wife, her suicide. The way that was drizzled in because it was kind of a spread out moment. You get some flashes to like the pills in the bathroom, and then we go back and we do some other stuff for a couple minutes, and then we come back to it, but then we go away again, and then your Kitty's looking for Robert in the woods, and then when it just kind of what's coming, but just the way it was drizzled in, and Kitty's reaction to Robert, I think said a lot about that. For me, was kind of a more defining moment in their relationship, where like she clearly knows he's not faithful, but kind of just gets down to business, and just handles it very well. And you can still kind of see I think the love in her interaction with him. It's like a get it together man, because it doesn't matter, people are counting on you. That for me was just solid. I think a lot of Oppenheimer's relationships were not really super well defined for me in the movie, and that was a frustration. But this moment, I think, was one of the better ones that helped define it and give both his relationship with previous wife and Kitty.
Yeah, and there's this interesting echo too that I feel like comes later in the film of when she says something along the lines of, I don't remember the exact line, but like, you can't also mourn the consequences of your own sin.
Mm,
Which I think is just like interesting to put into conversation with the whole kind of third act of this movie where they explore his sense of impending like moral responsibility of the Manhattan Project and all of the work that he put in to create this weapon of mass destruction. Like I think it feels like this little foreshadowing, and this is one of those moments where there's a lot there. There's so much to ponder. There's a lot there, and I think had they been able to like weave these a little bit more tightly together, they really could have been an interesting theme throughout that set up and paid off more closely. And I think there's like a looser thread there that we have to kind of like forage for. And I think that there's a lot of like interesting uh, moments of those connections between so many of the different aspects of this movie that would have been really great to have tightly woven together. Even just the relationship that he has with Kitty in general, there's a lot of complexity in the dynamic of their relationship, and even that ending scene of her crying and him and her recognizing like, hey, like you have fallen from grace from the public, and what does that mean, and what is your responsibility in that, like, and his desire to kind of be a martyr, and her reflection on that. I think that just there's so much more to mine there that I wish we had either time or focus to go deeper into those aspects. But yeah, that scene, I think, just from a film perspective, was so elegantly done. You know, that could have leaned a little bit too heavily into the melodrama of that moment and that relationship, but I thought it was just elegantly done the way they cut back and forth and artistically kind of shot that sequence in the bathroom too.
And I also think like Emily Blunt does such a good job in this film. Uh, I I don't think there was that much for her to work with on the page for Kitty, but she brings so much to this character, and she's able to communicate so much. And I feel like that scene is a great example of her just kind of stealing the show in that moment. And it was great to see her all throughout, even though she is not a main character, she's not a big focus, and we don't learn a lot about her. I still feel like Emily Blunt did a really good job bringing that character to the screen and bringing something that's such a sharp contrast to Oppenheimer to the screen. And I loved seeing her pop up. I wanted so much more of her, and like you said, Jen, I wanted more of that dynamic between them. But I am I'm glad that such a talented actress was placed in that role, because she was probably able to make it into more than maybe they originally intended for it to be.
yeah. And her interview with the gray board at the end,
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that was electric.
it was like, oh, there she is. Like, man, I would have loved more of this throughout the movie. It was that was a chilling scene in a good way. It just stopped everything. You could feel Robert just getting pummeled, and her frustration throughout the movie about like, why aren't you fighting? Why aren't you fighting? And so she finally got that chance to poke back, and she did it.
Okay, so proposal. Uh, we get another version of this but it's Kitty is the protagonist. And we get to see her doing all the stuff, and Emily Blunt can just kill it for however long.
That could be really interesting, actually.
Yeah, I mean, just like an example of like there's these dimensions that you this movie could have spent so much time just on that dynamic and the conversations and the processing of this character together with Kitty around like what them their choices and the decisions that they make and um, teasing out a lot of the like internal dilemmas that they both are experiencing together. I think like that in and of itself could have been an incredible film as well.
Yeah. It, I yeah, I think so. Those details are there, but they're so subtle. Like I'm going to have to watch this again. Like at least one more watch. Um because I that's kind of my big frustration with it is I got little crumbs of some of those relationship details of some
Yeah.
of Robert's morals, but it
Hmm.
just wasn't padded out enough. And like First Wife, for example, this was my one like, okay, what's going on and why aren't you going to tell me anything? Is First Wife, they have their love scene in the bedroom, cool romance, and then like the very next scene is she hates him and is throwing away his flowers and isn't coming out with him, and that just never got explained. Like, what happened? Why are they upset? How far in the future did we jump? What's going on? And they just kind of brushed right by it, and that was frustrating.
Yeah, the whole Jean storyline I thought was it feels so intentionally woven into this story. Like we probably get more screen time with Jean and Oppenheimer together than we do with Oppenheimer and his wife. You know what I mean? Like that emotional relationship seems to be very significant for Oppenheimer. Whether it's this like electric connection that they have or this emotional outlet that he has with her or the way that he feels needed by her and to support her. I mean, clearly from the beginning of the relationship, there is a emotional instability that he kind of fulfills in her. And like, what does that say about him as a character and a person that there's some pull that he has towards her? Like, I think there's just so much more there, but you're right, Dylan. Like, we kind of touch on it. She makes a little appearance here and there, but it's kind of woven in there for color. Um, but there seems to be such a level of intention to include so much time spent in their conversations together. I mean, partially it serves the storyline around his ties to the Communist Party and things like that. But even beyond that, I think that there's this emotional relationship and connection that they have that we don't see any other person in his orbit have the same way that she has with him together, like a
Mhm.
vulnerability that she brings out in him as well. And when we see him in every other context, he is put together, he is poised, he is leaning into this part of his brain and his psyche that he doesn't get to show until he's with her. So I thought that there's such a significance there, but you're right. I think there needs more time to like tease that apart, or perhaps a second viewing.
Yeah. Mm.
Sarah, I'm curious your complicated relationship with this movie that has surfaced over the course of the past couple of days as well. Unpack some of the pieces or the details that maybe have contributed to that.
Yeah, so I just think some of the creative choices in this are interesting. So, like for example, when they build Los Alamos, the film portrays it as this like uninhabited land, but that's not reality. And like American citizens were forced to leave their homes and their land, and their homes were destroyed so that Los Alamos could be built in its place. And so I think because this film is really, getting you to think about all of these different complicated moral angles around, Oppenheimer, I hate that they didn't include that detail in this film, because it's not just that like this atomic bomb was created, which is huge and that's awful, and there's lots of things to talk about with that. But I think even the way that it was created and that people's lives were destroyed. And because it was kept a secret, then surrounding towns, people were poisoned basically because of all the radiation. And so then there's high degrees of cancer deaths and all of that. So like there is such a larger scope to this than I think this film is interested in covering. And I'm like, okay, I get that because it's about Oppenheimer. But then what does that say about us and the stories that we tell? Because the stories that we tell shape how we view history and how we view ourselves. And so, what is this saying when we erase these parts of an already complicated history and an already morally difficult part of our history? So I don't know. I've just been grappling with these things of like, I don't know how to feel about this because it's so technically good, but also we've eliminated some parts of the story that I think would have added some really helpful color, uh, because this is really focused on grappling with the morality of what was done, but they left out some aspects. I don't know. So I feel complicated.
Hmm. I I wish I knew more historically, because my initial reaction to that, and you already said it, is that the movie is about Oppenheimer, not about the bomb, you know? And so my initial thought is, well, maybe Oppenheimer didn't really give much thought or have any moral qualms about, um, the radiation and the fallout, there in New Mexico. But I don't know, because at the same time, I do know that at least in his younger years, he was very like socially conscious, and in the movie there is one mention when he's talking to, is it Eisenhower? But he's like, give the land back to the Native Americans, um, uh, so I don't know. I'm torn on that. I definitely hear what you're saying, but like I wonder how much of that was Oppenheimer as a real person, like didn't really worry about, like that wasn't a moral concern of his.
Yeah, that's really interesting to have uncovered, Sarah. And what's interesting also is that this movie is willing to invite the grappling of like moral dilemmas. It actually is already it's already done that. And so I'm intrigued why they didn't choose to like have even an efficient way to be able to weave that in. You know what I mean? Like it's already in line with the theme of the film to like pose the question of choices were made at the time that were optimized for a certain end goal. When we look back, were those choices still um, good, and does the end justify the means and all of that? Like there's a scene I think where they're are proposing to build Los Alamos, and I think someone says, might have been Oppenheimer, somebody else says, oh, like no one lives here, it's all just open land. The film could have just said, hey, there's people here, but it's
Right?
okay, like we'll figure out how to move them, and weave that in later on to like part of Oppenheimer's guilt is not only obviously the lives that were taken when the bombs were used abroad, but also what were the effects of like all of those people. That it's a few short lines that they could have kind of maintained that historical accuracy in an efficient way, and it doesn't deter away from the movie's willingness to already grapple with these moral dilemmas. There's other like historical retellings in movies that I think are just not interested in that at all. Like they just want to paint their hero, their historical hero, as a hero. But I think this movie's already shown to be willing to lean into that. So I feel like the additional cost of them being true to historical accuracies and invite in those moral dilemmas is not as high.
And I think that's why I've been kind of like struggling with this movie in particular more than others.
Mm-hmm.
Is just like you said, Jen, like it already is this complex moral mixture. And our protagonist is complicated, and he is wrestling with his own morality. So having these extra little data points, I don't feel would I don't know, affect the movie that much other than shining a light on some things that actually happened. I don't know. So that's that's kind of where I've been struggling a little bit. And I know it's like a little point to be like stuck on as much as I am, but I I do think that when stories like this are told, especially because it is based on a true story and it has the Nolan name attached to it, it becomes how we view history. And so I feel like even details like that, even if they're little, are still important to include in here, because this might be people's only understanding of Oppenheimer and they might not do the research. So I wish that there had been those little extra things added in to give maybe a more well-rounded picture of what actually happened. I don't know.
That's that's fair. See, now I really want to watch that scene again because when they are talking about Los Alamos and Jen, you mentioned it, this is empty land, nobody lives here, but the Oppenheimer does say the Indians come up here from time to time, and he says something else about it because he says something like I'm trying to remember he says that and then says something about like something to do about it, or it might just be a dismissive like it's no big deal. But like I'm wondering how much, even in the midst of like the persecution of the Jews and how that's a obviously a theme since World War II, but like they play on that with Oppenheimer's Jewish heritage a bit. I wonder how much of that is a well, I'm concerned about this because it affects me, but like truly at the time there was that oppression and nobody here in this in at Los Alamos like thought or cared about it. I'm curious. Like I want to look at like some more little cues as they talk about because there are a couple references. Now I'm really curious. Like I'm trying to figure out, is it an omission or is there something that
Ah,
they're trying to talk about the actual morals of these people? They didn't care about it. Even in the midst of all the racial going
Mm.
on and the concern
that's
for the
really interesting.
Jews,
Hmm.
they didn't, you know, they didn't have any moral scruples about the treatment of the Native Americans.
That is an interesting perspective. Yeah, which is that, like, regardless of what our 2023 recognition of the impacts are, like for Oppenheimer, perhaps the effects of having to migrate this group of people or the effects on their communities, like for him, was not part of his guilty conscience. It was fixated and more focused on um, the bombings in Japan, and that was the fuel for him. And so the movie also is kind of taking the perspective, the moral perspective of Oppenheimer himself. That's an interesting read. I hadn't thought about that.
Because the morals of Oppenheimer are also at minimum questionable, but at its worst the movie definitely hints at like he just didn't have morals and just kind of used it as a tool because they mention it, and this is where like oh my gosh, the
Mm.
breadcrumbs where it just like gets subtly dropped and it's up to you the viewer to build your own opinion. But they mention one of the first times early in the movie when Oppie, the one professor dude I don't remember, and his brother Frank go out, and he's like, "I love New Mexico. I love physics. I wish I could combine them." And so I wonder how much it was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm in charge of a project. I can do this thing." And you saw how excited he was about the project when the general comes and talks to him. And so I wonder how much like morals weren't an issue. He wanted to have his own laboratory in New Mexico, the place that he loved and was his solace, his reprieve from the rest of the world. It was like, I'm doing it. I don't care. This is where we're going to build it. I wonder how much of it wasn't a strategic play that was the best. Just this is what I want for me and forget the consequences.
Yeah, I'm curious both of your perspectives on this film's positioning of Oppenheimer as a hero, a villain, a man who is after his own legacy and his selfish ambition, or if there truly was a sense of remorse and moral responsibility. Like, I think the film leaves it pretty open ended, which is it's I loved. I thought that was really smartly done. But I'm curious your interpretations on, based on the way that the film's presented, Oppenheimer throughout the film. What's your read on what the film seems to be saying?
Sarah, you want to take this one first or you want me?
Oh man. Um, well, because I was going to kind of answer it with a non-answer. So,
Ooh. O-
Dylan, you can go
Okay.
first.
Okay. Um, for me, the story as told, my interpretation of the breadcrumb trail is Oppenheimer was really in it for himself. I got the Jurassic Park vibes of, right, you were so worried about whether or not you could that you didn't stop
Yes.
to think about whether or not you should. Um,
Yes.
because it seems like he is very he's egotistical, he knows his abilities, he wants to prove himself. And as soon as because he even mentions when they first figure out splitting the uranium atom or whatever that he's like, well, everybody's going to be thinking the same thing, bomb. So he knows this. Cue some time progressing. General comes to him and is like, I want you in charge of a project. And Oppenheimer very clearly is like, cool, I'm working for the military. We're gonna cause a lot of destruction. Like, you want to build a bomb. Like, he knows this. How does he react? He like, that is the most happy animated I think you see him in the entire film. He gets up, he's drawing on the chalkboard, here's what you're going to do, he's smiling, he's smoking a cigarette, like he is drinking that in. And I think as he goes in and starts building the bomb, and even as they're like, well, it could blow up, and you see he's kind of got some concern there, but like, it still doesn't stop him. He just continues to go forward no matter what. And I do think the story is told, he was out to prove his own worth, and could he do this, could he be like this ultimate, physicist. But I do think the story convinces me that by the end of his life, as he starts going through all the interviews and as he starts speaking out about the harmful effects of atomic bombs, I think he clearly goes beyond just, I want to be in the spotlight, right? Like, I've lost my time to shine, so I'm going to now talk about the negatives just to stay, positive where I can. I think he goes beyond that. The story convinces me that he truly has a change of heart and begins to regret what he's created, both through all the times where people are like, why aren't you fighting this? Like, why are you dragging yourself through it? Why don't you just accept these things? And he's like, I love my country. Unfortunately, like, I'm going to stick through this. Also, with all the flashbacks, the feet stomping, him just having kind of the white light images as he's in like the interview room. So I do think starts as selfish, ends as, I kind of regret this. And I don't know how history is going to remember me. And that's where I also don't know, like, does he become kind of more conscious about it out of a selfish interest? Because he's like, well, I wanted to be remembered, but now I don't want to be remembered as the villain. It's just this, it's such a complicated moral entanglement. And that's why I love this movie so much. I thought it delivered that so well, because I still don't know. I really don't know, but that's my best guess.
Well, and so one of the things that I love that this movie does is that as they are working toward the bomb, he is just in it. He is excited. This is what he wants to do. Like, yes, this is the best. And it appears that he doesn't really grapple with the consequences of his actions until after the bombs have been dropped. And
Mm,
I think that that is a super interesting like character choice. And I think that ties together the fact that he is a theoretical physicist and his struggles in the lab. Like, he's so good at, you know, doing all of the physicsy things and figuring out all of these difficult concepts. But then when those concepts are actually made reality, he doesn't when these concepts are theory, he doesn't have to grapple with the morality. And so it takes him a little while to actually catch up. And it's only after destruction is done that he then begins to grapple with it. And I love that the film gives us these other characters like Niels Bohr, who is his, idol, who is like, nope, this is a bad idea. I want nothing to do with this. I'm going to be advocating against this. And even his friend, um, is like, nope, this is a bad idea. So we see these other scientists who are like, I see where this is heading. I have grappled with the morality and I don't want to be a part of it. And Oppenheimer doesn't seem to go on that journey until after his creation is finished. And I think that that's very interesting. um, I don't think my reading of Oppenheimer is as generous as yours, Dylan. I I don't know that I read him ending with remorse. I don't know. I don't know that he, or if he does get to remorse, like you said, like I think it was from like pure selfish intentions as opposed to actually like regretting his decisions. But I think I view him pretty negatively. Uh, I don't know, and I
Hmm,
think that that selfishness and that ego is what drives a lot of his decisions all throughout.
that makes sense. Can I ask as a follow-up, what do you make of kind of the cutaways where he zones out with the bright lights, with the stomping of the feet?
Oh, those were so good.
Yeah, it's such a great visual way to show the idea of like self-reflection and contemplation
Yeah.
and um a sense of moral responsibility without having to say a word, like you see him really think about consequences in a very visual way. It's just difficult to do. They somehow did it so beautifully though.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that those come after the Trinity test and then after the bombs were dropped on Japan. So I think that's a super interesting choice that he is now able to reflect after his creation has gone from theory to reality. But he didn't have the capacity maybe for that reflection beforehand. So, yeah, those scenes were brilliant though. Oh my gosh, I was engrossed and engaged and horrified and all of the emotions all at one time. Just phenomenally done.
And what's really interesting about the morality of and his reactions to his moral conscience is that I think that there is a sense of realization of the stakes and the consequences that he is ushered in. But then the question is, does a lot of his actions in the public eye, are they truly because he is fighting for um, a moral compass that he believes in, or is it to self manage his own legacy too? Because I think that there's a brief comment, I forget if I remember being from Kitty, but it could have been someone else close to him, but I think they make some comment around like, you can't put yourself as a martyr and expect that to absolve you of responsibility. And there's a small moment there where I was like, oh, interesting. Like his public advocacy for fighting against the development of the hydrogen bomb and fighting against and being like an advocate in the policy sphere. Is that for truly his moral convictions? Or is it also because, like you're mentioning, Dylan, he doesn't want to be remembered as the father of the atomic bomb that has ushered in the nuclear age and wants to like has an awareness of his legacy that he's leaving for himself and can now have the time and space to shape and mold that a little bit more and portray himself to be um, someone who is pushed and used by the government to create this with his science, but ultimately has an awareness towards the end of his life about the moral consequences. Like it's the same sense of remorse, but then where it's channeled in, whether it's self interested versus truly for the public good, I think it's kind of gray. And like you were mentioning, Dylan, unknown to us, but there seems to be suggestion of potentially both directions.
Yeah, this is where, like, I love the choice and that it's open to the viewer, but I wish we could have gotten more details and background because and I know it's already a 3-hour movie. I know, but I would have left like another 30 minutes. Because so I a couple weeks ago started reading American Prometheus. I did not know that this movie was going to be like so literally like baked into it. But like Robert's early childhood is very traumatic and incredibly socially awkward, and he kind of like he is 100% an outcast. And I think the movie kind of as he's, a doctor kind of plays him out to be kind of I got vibes at times of like not James Bond, but like he seems to just kind of like float into parties and he can have small talk and chit chat, but like he gets horrifically bullied as a child, and like I would have loved some of that. And he has a really rough time with his parents, and I don't know, I just like I felt like some of those things could have helped give more clues and details about his life and his motives. And he also was like known for like horseback riding in Los Alamos before it was Los Alamos, like when he went to his ranch, for being like very risky. And he would go sailboating, and again, like very risky. His parents were like furious at him multiple times. His passengers would like remark that like they were scared and would ask him to slow down, but he would refuse, because he was like, "Well, I'm confident, I know what I'm doing." And so the book like flirts a lot with like he enjoys danger. He was egotistical and enjoyed that like sense of danger, and was very much an outcast from society, which I feel like is a perfect recipe for making a mega bomb. But we didn't get any of that in the movie, even though it was based on the book. I don't know. I wanted some of that.
Dylan wants the like 8 episode mini docu
Yes,
series, cinematically created, all the
HBO, let's
content,
go. Yeah.
deep dive into this man and his life and what shaped him. Yeah, I think if you bring up an interesting like desire, Dylan, which I also felt, which is that there's this movie is pretty, I would say, event driven. Like there are these interesting character moments, but I also wanted to know more about who this man is, and I think if I had had that, this would have felt a little bit more grounded. But there's just also so many events and conversations and meetings with scientists and all this stuff that needs to be woven in as well, that there just isn't enough time. So like there's a version of this that also really dives deep into like who is this person, what created him to be this way, that is set up his genius, but also his desire to be the one to like spearhead this. And then that fall to the moral guilt and all of that, like all of that is in and of itself so interesting. Just focusing on this human, the
So
Oppenheimer cinematic universe is what Dylan needs.
Yes.
We need a kitty spin-off show,
yes, I'm here for it. So I guess what's interesting then is that this film kind of sacrifices giving us that additional information about Oppenheimer to frame the whole thing with Strauss' confirmation hearing and all of his stuff. And so I did that work for you guys? Was that a helpful framing device, or did you think that that maybe detracted from what the information was that you really wanted to learn more about? I love it when you start with a sigh. That's the best answer. It's so good. Yes.
Well, he Christopher Nolan very clearly like wanted to focus on Oppenheimer. The movie was not about the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb has a lot to do with Oppenheimer, obviously, but like we clearly get so much of Oppenheimer's life. And to some extent, obviously Strauss was a big part of that. He was the one that started all the stuff that like set Oppenheimer on like uh, getting ruined basically. So I get that. Like he needed to be in there. But we spent a lot of time on that confirmation hearing, and like the big reveal at the end of like, well, Strauss was behind it all, and his conversation with his, assistants and things that are prepping him. And like we spent a lot of time with that reveal, and I feel like it was used as a crutch to tie the whole thing together. Because I think that's a struggle with a biopic, is a person's life generally just does not have this like nice, tidy, climactic, like boom, go to credits. And so I feel like that was just used as something to carry it along, and also as kind of again, I kind of think it was just a crutch. It was a reason to flash back and forth between the future where he's being interviewed and interrogated, Oppenheimer, well, and I guess Strauss too, and then going back and interlacing the past and how we got to this moment. But I do kind of wish they wouldn't have spent so much time with that, and instead would have given me more time with Oppenheimer's character.
Yeah, I tend to fall into that camp as well, which is I want to just go deep into the like who this person is and let that be grounding the story, and then the events unfold, but we are rooted and anchored into this person and the choices that they make and what that says about themselves and how they think about the world. But I think the trade-off that this framing device does with the time cutting and the hearing is that it ushers in this theme and this kind of searing indictment of the way that the the country uses you. Like, to your point, Dylan, in your one sentence summary, like, the house always wins, you
Mhm.
know. And there's that comment in that conversation that he has with Einstein around, when your country ultimately turns your back on you after you've served it, like, sometimes you just have to leave or accept that. And so it brings in this other dimension and this theme around the way that the government has used this person's genius for its own end, and when it's no longer expedient for them, they will chew you out as well. Which I think is another, point that this movie kind of indexes on, and I think that's the trade-off that they seem to make, is they don't have time to go deep into this character-driven story because we're looking at this whole thing unfolding kind of from a macro scale as well. But Sarah, did that time jumping and that framing device work for you with the hearings?
Yeah, I think that it did on the whole. I really love how that was used to make this feel more action packed. I think if this were told in a linear fashion, then it would be kind of boring, except for like the bomb stuff. But I think because we're jumping back and forth in time, we have all of these different competing interests and these competing players. I think the difference between the color and the black and white also helps just like force you to pay attention and forces you to keep up with this pace. So in that regard, I really liked it. I do think, however, the final third of this film, because the bomb goes off at around the 2 hour mark, and so then we're left with like a whole hour of just people talking. I think that is probably a bit of a letdown for me, just because like it's hard to compete with the Trinity test and a bomb going off. Like, it's hard to follow that up. So I think that last third, I was a little like, okay, can we move it along? But I was still interested. But I do wonder what this movie would be like if it was truly like a character study, which I don't think we would get from Christopher Nolan.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a Christopher
Mm.
Nolan movie. So I'm interested to see like a different version of the Oppenheimer story that is really focused on who he was as a person, and some of those inconsistencies and conflicts within his own character and how he worked those out. I feel like that would be really interesting. But I think for a Christopher Nolan film, this works. And I also loved uh, Robert Downey Jr.'s performance. I thought that he
Oh,
did a
Yeah.
phenomenal
yes.
job,
Mhm.
especially after so many years of us seeing him in the MCU. I feel like this is a really great reminder of just how great of an actor he is, and him going like, "Hey, I am not
I
Iron
still
Man.
got it.
Pay attention to me." So
Yeah.
I feel like he was very effective in it, and that made it fun to watch those scenes for me.
Yeah, I 100%. I had a note down I wanted to talk about like the actors and actresses that really stood out for me, and Robert Downey Jr. I did. I forgot. I completely forgot just that he
Yeah.
was an Iron Man. Like for a second, like I saw Strauss several times and was like, "Who is that? Is that
Yeah.
Robert Downey Jr.?" And it was incredible. It was incredible. And Cillian Murphy, Cillian, is that how you say it?
I think it's Killian.
Ooh, well Murphy. Um, how I don't think
Yeah.
they could have cast a better choice. He looks like Oppenheimer. If you look at like old pictures of actual Oppenheimer,
Hmm. It's
like
Mhm.
wild.
yes, but the I think something that Murphy does really well is his eyes.
Yes.
Like
Mhm.
he is able to convey so much thought just through the reactions in his eyes. That I think is perfect for a scientist and especially a morally scrupulous or not scrupulous, but morally ambiguous one. It just really sold it for me. I can't think of anybody who would have done a better job as Oppenheimer.
And I think it's extra impressive because like 70% of the film is just his face, just
Hmm.
taking up the whole screen. So, I mean, what a movie to star in when it's a lot of just your face and you just have to emote and explain everything with just your face. And he does a fantastic job.
Also, who was the lawyer for Strauss at the end in the gray board? The mean
The young
lawyer?
dude?
Yeah, the one who was like against Oppenheimer that was like beating up on everybody that he and Kitty had their like thing with.
Jason Clarke, who plays Roger Robb. Is that who you're
Ye-
talking about?
yes.
Is it the one that betrays Strauss at
Oh
the
yeah, yeah,
end
yeah.
in that last scene?
Jason Clark. Uh,
Okay.
oh, I- like for just a relatively small role. I mean, in a 2-hour movie, it probably would have been much more substantial. But in the context of 3 hours smaller, I thought Jason Clark was phenomenal.
Yeah, the electricity that he brings. Benny Safdie's also fabulous in this as
Oh,
well. You know,
Mm,
yes.
this like sense of like moral compass, but then you see that evolve over the course of the film, and then he's the one that's leading the development of the hydrogen bomb. I also thought that I'm just surprised at these small little cameos from like massive stars. You know, like Rami Malek makes a little appearance with like 2 lines in the hearing. It's pretty impressive. You're just like
Yeah.
a buffet of incredible actors in this that make small appearances and big appearances as well. Gary
And Gary
Oldman's
Oldman,
like
yes, as a president.
just casually, couple lines here.
Yeah. Yeah, this is my favorite type of movie though, where it's just so stacked and so every time somebody comes onto the screen you're like, "Oh wait, that's so and so." It's just a fun little game to play. It's the best.
Okay, any other last thoughts about Oppenheimer before we wrap up?
Okay, can I say two quick things?
Yes.
Okay, first thing is I found a pinky ring in this
Oh
movie.
my gosh, does Dylan know about your pinky ring theory?
I don't know. So
no.
Okay, give
I
the
have
overview.
this theory that in movies, if a specifically a man wears a pinky ring, he tends to be a villain. And so I'm just on a mission to spot pinky
Okay.
rings to support my theory. Uh, and in this movie, it was in the meeting with the secretary, one of the generals, I think the general's name was George C. Marshall, I'm not sure, but he was wearing a pinky ring and he was advocating for the use of the atomic bomb.
Mm,
So there's that.
another data point to
Another
add to our little
data
collection.
point. Yes, we are collecting these left and right. And so then I would also just like to give a quick shout out. In the like gray committee scenes, there was a dude sitting in the corner who was fake typing on a stenography machine. And he was just giving me life. And I just had to have a chuckle every time he was in frame, just fake typing on the stenography machine. It was great.
Really?
Oh,
Oh,
that's
I'm so excited
hilarious.
to
Yeah.
rewatch and see that.
Oh, it's so good. And like you can tell when he's like not fully in frame, like he's not really typing, and then you'll see him get in frame and then he'll his fingers start moving, but like they're not moving as you would if you're actually using the stenography machine, so it's so funny. He was great.
Well, you know that there's going to be some Reddit thread somewhere of these like Nolan hyper fans, just like Nolan nerds that are like unpacking every little detail, you know, and like, what does that mean? And how does that contribute to the larger story? What was Nolan trying to say?
I
With
mean,
like
honestly,
super fans,
it was a sham of a hearing, so why wouldn't you have a fake stenographer with a fake
right?
record?
It was an artistic choice
Yeah,
from
man, it was
Christopher Nolan
great.
himself.
I loved it.
I want to give a quick little shout out to the score. I think the score is so strong in this
Oh,
movie and
yes.
Mm.
adds so much to the momentum and adrenaline that you experience in some of those big action scenes. Um, so, Dylan, I imagine that the IMAX experience of just being like engulfed in the score must have just been absolutely incredible. But I think it adds a lot to this movie.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, my chest was reverberating for the whole 3 hours, it felt like, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then some of those opening scenes of just like how they visually are trying to portray like a genius physicist's brain, I just thought was, I was kind of cracking up to myself like, ooh, here's some reverberating lines on the screen with like just the sound effects. And we're supposed to believe that this is his brain just taking in the world, coming up with fabulous ideas.
See, and I thought that was super super well done, both for conveying his brain and how like chaotic it is, and you've got the
Mm-hmm.
particles going off and like droplets of water and stuff, and the like thin layer of water over the map. So I was like, oh cool, his brain is chaotic, whatever. I'm getting an understanding of him, but also they interwove it so well, and it felt like for me a crescendo up to the bomb, because each of those were kind of explosive, bright light on screen moments typically, and so it for me it played a really nice like dual role. I really, really, really enjoyed that interlacing throughout the first 2 hours.
That like visual thread that they strung. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
each time it would come on, it would kind of have like a louder uptick in the sound, and it became for me very reminiscent of like maybe not reminiscent, but foreshadowing of, well, we know the boom is coming from the test bomb.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
really nice.
All right. Well, this was our review and discussion of Oppenheimer. You can find it available out in theaters. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us, and thank you to you, Dillon, for joining us for this conversation. Where can people find more of you on the interwebs?
Well, thank you for asking. Myself and a longtime friend are launching a podcast called the Loop Podcast, or Leadership Opinions for Ordinary People, where we interview and talk amongst ourselves with normal managers in everyday life, not CEOs and bigwigs of Fortune 500s. We are still getting prepped, but you can connect with us on Instagram at Loop Leadership Podcast, and we're have our first 2 episodes recorded. We're going through editing and hope to have those posted in first week of September. So please keep an eye out for that on wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple. We'll be there.
Very exciting. Yes. You heard it here first. Beginning of September. Go check it out, y'all. All right. Well, our name for this podcast sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. Everyone is welcome here. And we're so glad you hung out with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you tune into your favorite shows. Drop us a review letting us know your thoughts about Oppenheimer. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at moviesandUsPod, or you can email us at moviesandUsPod@gmail.com. We will be back next week to the other half of the Barbenheimer hype, so we will be reviewing the film Barbie. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll see you next week.